Ghostly home invasion. I'm sharing this story, which was told by my grandmother. It was in the summer of 1976 in Long Beach, California. We lived in this building that used to be the church's attic, hence the reason it was on top of the church. They emptied it out and rented it as a 3-bedroom apartment. Your Aunt Laura was pregnant with her first child and had the room that used to be used for Sunday school. She had a bookshelf in the corner by the window, and she was home alone. She was in the bathroom when she heard her bedroom door slowly being shut, so she turned off the faucet and yelled for me, thinking it was me, putting laundry in her drawers. Of course, I was at work. Everyone else was at school. So she walked over to the hall and saw her door shut, so she began to yell, "Mom, are you?" And that's when the door shot back open, and she screamed and fell back into the wall. That's when I knocked on the door for her to open it, but on the third knock it just opened. I walked in and expected to see her, but she was sitting crying in the hallway. I threw my bag down. I began to jog over to her when her book started to fly off the shelf in threes into the hallway, hitting the wall, and I grabbed my chest and gasped as she ran into the bathroom and shut herself in there. I got down and started to pray out loud, and the book stopped flying, so I shut up and listened. I heard every cabinet, window, door, and faucet open and turn on, so I yelled for Lori to come out to the living room, and she did. Once she got over to me, I grabbed her, and we left the house and ran down the church and cried out for the pastor for help. He apparently heard the commotion because he said to close the doors and pray with him. We slept in the church that night, and the next day, he gathered up the courage to tell us the reason they rented out the attic. It was because they believed the devil made its home up there, and they wanted no part of that with the church after all the tragedies: a newborn's death, a child being possessed, and a Sunday school teacher's suicide by jumping out the window next to Laura's bookshelf. That happened up there. Needless to say, we moved out 3 days later to the next city. The ghost at my door. I am a 24-year-old female. This story happened to me in 2004 when I was around the age of 12 or 13. I had many paranormal experiences, but this one really stand out because it was my first one and I didn't have any clue what was going on. So one night, I was laying in my bed asleep, and I happened to wake up in the middle of the night, probably around 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning. I had my bedroom door closed at the time, and shortly after awakening, I heard soft but noticeable knocks at my door. My room was completely dark, but at the time, I didn't think anything of it, so I got up to see what was going on, and when I opened the door, there was no one there. Just to put things in perspective, I live in a 2-bedroom apartment with my mom, my uncle, my mother's coworker, and her daughter. Everyone in the apartment was asleep except for me, and the bathroom light was very bright, and I could see clearly everything. Not knowing what was going on, I just closed my door and climbed back into bed. Around 2 minutes later, I hear that knock again, so once again, I slide out of bed and open the door only to find no one there. Again, I closed the door and told myself if this happens again, I'm just gonna leave the door open, because I'm not gonna keep getting out of bed once again after laying down for about 2 minutes. So I hear knocks again, so I slide out of bed and open the door, this time walking away, not seeing anyone and leaving the door open. So I climb back into bed again, and this is where things get strange. I lay my head on the pillow and close my eyes for about 1 second, and that's when I hear the sound of footsteps dragging across my carpet. Now, the carpet that we lived in was carpeted from wall to wall, but you would have to literally be digging your feet into the carpet to make a dragging noise on this type of carpet. The dragging sound of footsteps continue until it got around 2 feet away from my bed. After the footsteps then, I started hearing someone breathing very heavily. I didn't know what to do, and I dared not to move, so I sat there. I assumed the spirit was my dead great-grandmother or one of my relatives, so I just started to talk and say random things, like my mom is doing fine, my uncle is doing fine, as well as other things that matter. The spirit just continued breathing. Eventually, I started to get tired and was still afraid, so I asked the spirit if you could leave now because I need to go back to sleep. And suddenly, the breathing stopped, and nothing else happened that night. A couple weeks later, I'm laying in bed asleep, and I wake up abruptly because I feel warm, heavy fingers on my eyelids. This really scared me, because when I woke up there was no one around, and once again, my bedroom door was open, and the bathroom light was shining brightly. I've had some paranormal experience after these two, but these are the most memorable ones, because they are my earliest experiences. Thank you for taking the time to read this story. It's freaking me out and it's creeped out everyone that I've told. Sincerely, your faithful subscriber. I saw something in my room as a child, and I've thought about it ever since. Okay, so I'm now 20 years old, so we're talking about 12 years ago, and I live in the east of England, not particularly somewhere that is synonymous with ghostly sightings, etc. But I feel this subreddit would fully appreciate this, as it's freaked me out since it happened. Quick layout of my bedroom for context. When walking through my door, there would be a wall on the left immediately, so the entirety of the room was basically to the right of the door. As soon as you walk through the door, there would be a small snooker table for kids, and then on the other side of that snooker table was my bed, then a bedside table, and then my desk. Nothing else was in the room at the time, as the room had just been renovated to be bigger for me as I was getting older. There were 2 windows on the opposite side of this rectangular room to my door, one directly opposite the door, and another opposite my bed. So, I lived in a suburban town with my 2 younger brothers and my parents when growing up. To be honest, we lived in that house for 10 years, since I was 2 years old, but nothing ever happened. But when I was 8, I remember waking up in the middle of the night and feeling very, very cold. Considering I was only 8 years old, these memories are extremely vivid still. I remember the tips of my fingers being so cold they were numb, despite it being warm enough for me not to want to cover. Weird, huh? This is when I panicked. Now, I used to be woken up by my brothers in the night quite a lot, as they are twins, and they would sleep in the same room. So normally waking up, I would assume that it was them messing around, but this time I knew something was different. I woke up on my back, and after feeling these sensations of coldness, I looked towards the door, and I can remember seeing someone standing in my doorway. Since I was only 8, my mom and my dad used to leave my door ajar so they could come in and see me if I shouted for them without waking up my brother and, with the slamming doors or whatnot. So, the door being ajar and someone standing in the doorway didn't bother me, as I thought it was my dad or someone else checking up on me. Added to this, my room was sort of dark but not fully. This was because there was a street lamp opposite our house on the road, and my room was on the front of the house. So my room would always be that darkness in which you could make out shapes, but never make out specific features. For all I could see was this shape of an adult. I remember saying, "Dad?" But no answer. Then it hit me that my grandparents lived around the corner from our house, and when I really squinted at this person in the doorway, I thought I made out the face of my granddad, so I called out his name. No answer. This is where things developed, but no answer for the first 2 names. I panicked and threw the covers over me like a normal child does. When I threw the covers over me, I turned onto my right-hand side so that my back was to the door and pulled the covers right over my head. I then did the typical child thing and counted to 10 in my head and then called out for Dad. I must have scared myself by this, as I then started getting more scared and shouted for Dad. My parents' bedroom was right next door, so usually it would only take them a few seconds to get through to me, especially if I was panicking and shouting like I was. But I shouted for a few minutes and got no answer. I then pulled the covers back slightly and looked over my left shoulder towards the door, and the thing had moved. It was now above the side of my bed. It was in the same position a monk sits in when meditating, legs crossed, etc., but it was sitting on thin air, about 5 foot off the floor. Despite it being about 1 foot away from me, I still couldn't make out any features, just the thought that this person was not my dad or my granddad, not even a man, but an elderly woman? Sounds typically horror story-ish, I know, but that's what I could make out. I freaked out at this point and screamed. This is when my dad came running in, and the thing just sort of developed a mouth and opened it wider and wider than a normal human can, and then disappeared altogether. My dad still says he found me in a massive cold sweat, shaking from head to foot. After that, I refused to sleep in my room for about 2 years, as I felt massively uncomfortable, as if I was always being watched. Again, typical, I know. So, I slept in my brother's bedroom from then on. Now, as I got older, I passed it off as a dream, yet 2 things stopped this from being the case. I woke up on my back, only to be on my right-hand side in the fetal position when my dad ran in, which is the position he found me in. This surely also rules out sleep paralysis. The whole experience was completely linear, no sudden breaks, as if I was waking up. I remember the whole thing like it was yesterday, despite it being 12 years ago. The second thing, which perhaps makes me believe this is something more, is this. When I asked to move out of my room into my brother's room, my parents were surprisingly okay with it. I had asked before the experience, but they would always say no, as they thought we would just stay up until stupid hours playing games or whatever. But this time, they were fine with it. I found out why when I was 14. After we moved out, when I asked my mom at that age why she let me move into my brother's room. She said she wasn't comfortable with the room I was in, and that whilst we lived in that house being the age that we were, she didn't want to frighten us. But the elderly lady we bought this house off of had tripped and fallen down the stairs, dying at the bottom of them, and found days later by a friend. Apparently, her room was my room. Now my parents are both skeptical of any form of ghosts or apparitions, but my dad's dog, a Jack Russell, would spend a lot of time sleeping at the end of my bed as a child, and would growl in the night some nights. Added to this, he would sit in the hallway and stare at the bottom of the stairs for literally hours. I never thought anything of it, as I didn't know what had happened there. But now I know about the death, the growling of our dog, and his strange bouts of staring at the bottom of the stairs make me think this was perhaps a little more than a dream. Sorry if this was long-winded, but this case just adds to the many stories on here, and considering the circumstances surrounding the house and the vividness of that night, despite my age.